We usually read ancient texts for history or for faith, but what if we looked at them as something else? What if we read them like a cookbook or a detailed pantry list for one of the most influential cultures in history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're putting on our food scientist hats to break down one of the most detailed diets ever recorded. So, we're going to peel back the layers and ask a really simple question. What was actually on the menu? We're going to look at the raw ingredients, the very specific ways they were prepared, and the incredible meaning that was baked into every single meal. Trust me, this is about way more than just ancient history. It's about how food can literally define a people. All right, so here's our plan. First, we're going to stock our ancient pantry. Then, we'll get into the really strict rules that governed every meal. After that, we'll follow their journey from scarcity to abundance through the food they ate. And finally, we'll wrap up by exploring that powerful link between food, faith, and community. Okay, first things first. Let's talk raw materials. What did they actually have to work with? Well, the texts give us a surprisingly detailed shopping list that was the foundation for everything they ate. The absolute foundation, the bedrock of their diet, was grain. You see wheat and barley mentioned everywhere, not just as food, but as supplies for armies and even as part of religious offerings. It's pretty clear. When you needed to feed people, you started with wheat and barley. They were storable, versatile, absolutely essential. But of course, you can't live on bread alone, right? And that's where legumes come in. Things like beans and lentils were a nutritional powerhouse. They're often listed right alongside the grains as being critical supplies. The real hearty stuff that kept people fueled day in and day out. Now, this is where it gets really interesting from a food science perspective. In a world with no refrigeration, fruits you could dry they were everything. Figs and raisins weren't just a sweet snack. They were high-energy, perfectly portable calories. There's even a story of reviving a starving man with just a cake of figs and some raisins. This was life-saving stuff. And, of course, there was livestock. Sheep, oxen, and goats. These animals were your primary source of meat, sure, but also dairy, milk, butter, cheese. Owning livestock was a direct sign of your wealth, and they were at the center of all of life's biggest moments, from huge feasts to the most important sacrifices. So we've stocked the pantry. But this diet wasn't just about what they ate, it was all about how they ate it. These texts lay out this incredibly specific system of rules that turned every single meal into a very deliberate act. Just look at this level of detail. It wasn't enough to just cook meat. It had to be roasted with fire, not boiled. Certain parts like fat and blood were completely forbidden. And then you have these fascinating rules like not boiling a young goat in its mother's milk, which points to this deep, symbolic separation of foods that really defined who they were. Let's take unleavened bread, for example. On a practical level, it's super simple. Flour, water, no yeast. But the rule to eat it for 7 days straight, that transformed this simple food into a powerful, tangible symbol of their history. A yearly reminder of an escape so hasty, there wasn't even time for bread to rise. The precision here is almost like a chemical formula. What they called a meat offering, which was actually grain, had exact ingredients. Not just any flour, it had to be fine flour. Not just any oil, it had to be beaten oil. And salt was mandatory. They called it the salt of the covenant. Frankincense was even added for aroma. Every single component was specified, nothing was left to chance. And they weren't just winging it with the amounts. The texts give exact measurements. 1/10 of an ephah of flour, that's about 2 quarts, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil, which is about another quart. This is not casual cooking. This is a meticulously controlled, repeatable process. From a food science angle, it's incredible to see this kind of standardization and quality control in such an ancient source. Okay, so we've covered the what and how, but now let's look at the bigger story. The diet we're talking about wasn't static, it changed radically, and those changes perfectly mirrored the epic journey of the people themselves. This timeline right here tells an amazing story. They look back at their time in Egypt, and they remember all this variety: fish, cucumbers, melons, garlic. Then, boom, they're in the wilderness, and their diet is reduced to a single food: manna. It's pure survival. But the place they're heading to? It's described almost entirely by its food. A land flowing with milk and honey, a place of butter, wheat, and wine. You could literally tell their entire history just by looking at their menu. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. Why did any of this matter so much? Because beyond just nutrition, food was woven into the very fabric of their society. It was a language, it was an act of worship, and it was the glue that held their entire community together. I mean, just listen to this. King David is desperate for a drink of water from his hometown. His best men risk their lives to go get it for him. But when they bring it back, he can't drink it. He pours it on the ground as an offering, saying the water is like their very blood. In that moment, a simple drink of water becomes a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice. And food was the heart of any celebration. When David became king, the texts describe this massive 3-day national feast. And you can see the logistics right here. People brought supplies from all over. You've got the basics: bread, wine, oil for sustenance. You've got the high-energy, easy-to-transport stuff like fig cakes and raisins. And then, for the celebration itself, tons of oxen and sheep. This wasn't just a party. It was a massive operation designed to bring an entire nation together around a shared table. Just as powerful as the feasts was the deliberate absence of food. Fasting wasn't a diet plan. It was a profound act of grief or desperate prayer. When David's child was sick, he fasted. When the nation mourned its first king, they fasted for 7 days straight. Withholding food was a way of speaking when words just weren't enough. And finally, getting an invitation to eat at the king's table, that was the ultimate symbol of honor and security. It meant you were under the king's personal protection. To be given a permanent seat at that table, like Mephibosheth was, meant you were being treated like royalty. It was a powerful political statement, and it was made with a plate of food. So as we've seen, this ancient diet was so much more than just a list of ingredients. It was a story. Their history, their laws, their values, their hopes, all encoded in what they ate. And that kind of leaves us with a fascinating question to think about for ourselves, doesn't it? If the food on your table told a story, what story would it tell about you?